Hey folks, what's happening? We are getting ready to move into, let me get this associated there a little bit better. I think that centers me a little bit more. Okay. Um, we're getting ready to start another chapter on a sociological theory of deviance, macro level sociological theory of deviance called social organization theory. When we talk about this, we'll find out that there was essentially two periods where this has been popular. One early on in the development of sociology, especially in the city of Chicago, with the School of or Chicago School of Sociology, and then it starts to pick up steam again in the mid 1970s and is still very relevant today. So, as I mentioned, social organization theory focuses on a macro structural look at society. It attempts to explain why certain neighborhoods control deviance and why others are unable to minimize or eliminate it. Now, a lot of times when we look at these theories, you might think to yourself, oh, that just makes sense, Troy. Well, maybe that's correct, but common sense is not always correct, and that's why you need to bring method and theory to bear on many of the things that we find in the real world. As I mentioned, starts at the University of Chicago around the end of the 19th century. Then it starts to pick up steam again in the mid to late 1970s and on through today. This is primarily, at least in the early stages, primarily looking at juvenile delinquency, but today it investigates deviance at the aggregate level. What I mean by this is we're looking at neighborhoods, schools, cities, international levels. This is very different than the individualistic approach, dare I say the psychological approach that much of criminology takes. It wants to blame the individuals that are performing these deviant acts, whereas the social disorganization folks are looking at, what in society, what structures in society are creating these types of deviant acts. When we look back at the Chicago School, University of Chicago, especially the School of Chicago or the School of Sociology, we're going back to like the 1890s. And what they were trying to do was set up to develop the first department of sociology in the U.S., the first systematic study of social behavior in the United States. Sociology as a scientific study of society is really what they're up to, and I want us to be careful with the scientific study of society, because that might be a little bit more than what the Chicago School of Sociology was up to. They were trying to understand different aspects of society, but maybe society as a whole might be biting off a little bit more than the discipline can chew. Some important topics that they were looking at: prostitution, alcohol consumption, violence, police abuse, power, all the things that happen either a lot or a very little in communities. They were interested in why these forms of deviance existed. Why did individuals deviate from the social norms? And then why they seemed to flourish in certain areas of the city while others seemed to be able to control these social problems. I'm guessing social cohesion, collective efficacy, some social capital. Those might be some things that might help us explain what's going on here. They're looking at two types of explanations. The first, the criminals and deviants were the new immigrants with their old traditions, not appropriately socialized into the new world. So this ties to a social instability that's tied to immigration patterns, and historically we blamed the immigrants. Various ethnicities face discrimination throughout history, and the way that they approach it, the way, the levels of criminality are different over time, and the numbers are not clear here on what's going on. Lumen goes on to suggest in 2002 an ethnic stratification ranking of minorities. We see that Italians faced ethnic discrimination. All groups that try to immigrate to the United States, if it's the first arrival of those groups, they all experience discrimination. It's just whether they're able to move past that discrimination. I teach a course on race and ethnicity, and if you look at the history of the United States in reference to immigration, certain types of people can immigrate to the United States, and over time, it takes about 3 generations, they can shed those ethnic characteristics and ultimately assimilate into society. Some, on the other hand, cannot. Those of color have a much harder time assimilating into the United States than those that are primarily Caucasian. But in 1918, the Italians were lumped in with the coloreds. And the difference between these two groups is the Italians were able to assimilate over time, and those of color were not. Still looking at the history of social disorganization theory, one of the examples of immigration in the United States were German Jews and how they suffered repression and discrimination in Germany. It's true that when they immigrated to the United States, they had fewer legal restrictions than they had in Germany, but they still suffered discrimination as well, and Jews continued to suffer discrimination. This is the same for Chinese immigrants in the 1800s. Hispanics have had a hard time and have been faced with ethnic stereotyping and discrimination. And of course, African Americans brought to the U.S. as slaves, they continue to face prejudice, discrimination, and outright racism. When we're looking at the origins of social disorganization theory, many draw off of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, published in 1859. This particular piece of work influenced Chicago sociologists in how they approached the study of human behavior. The Chicago perspective believed that environmental factors affected whether deviance in certain areas occurred or didn't occur. And so essentially, they're some of the first mappers. They had questions about what was going on in their social backyard, and many of the early sociological departments, many of the early universities, but up to depressed areas, slums, urban areas that are seen in reference to urban blight. That's by design. It's because it gave professors an opportunity to go out into the community and do studies that would then in turn allow them to understand what was going on. Allow them to understand what was going on in more of an in more than an anecdotal way. They wanted to bring scientific method and theory to the process of explaining what was going on in these communities. Sean McKay's social disorganization theory, many think that this is the origins of social disorganization theory. They're looking at juvenile delinquency and how it's mapped out in urban areas. They literally plotted maps of the home addresses of delinquent boys using zones and then tried to explain what was going on in the prevalent occurrences of juvenile delinquency in some areas and the less than prevalent occurrences of juvenile delinquency in other areas. What they found out was delinquency did not appear to be distributed randomly. Rates of delinquency appeared to cluster in neighborhoods and was highest near the central business district. And delinquency declines as you move away from the central business districts. So where the business is, that's where the crime is. And the further that you get away from these business areas that are characterized by certain descriptors, the less crime you tend to have. So in its purest formulation, social disorganization refers to the inability of local communities to realize the common values of their residents or solve commonly experienced problems. This is mostly due to structural problems characterized by high delinquency, even though the specific types of people changed over the decades. So this idea of blaming it on a specific type of person doesn't play out in the data over time, as when we see social instability, which means that certain groups of people come in and then they ultimately move out of those poor neighborhoods, and they're replaced by a different group that might have different ethnicity and different cultural values, but you still see the same types of delinquency. So the primary goal of the residents is to move out of the neighborhood, leaving little incentive to try to make it a better place. So when they're moving into these poor, structurally problematic and socially unstable areas, their first thought is, what do I need to do to get out of here? Oh my God, I can't live here. I can't put my kids on the front block to play kickball because there's an idea that they might get assaulted or shot. Their first thought is, how do I get out of here? And then a second aspect of this is that most of the people in these areas don't own the residences that they live in, and the landlords that do own them are not concerned with improving them. As a matter of fact, they're probably more concerned with, how do I make as much money off this property without doing any improvements at all? Some criticisms of social disorganization theory. Well, as the field of sociology or field of criminology, as it starts to develop, it shifts away from these structural explanations and it starts focusing more on individuals. So we move from a macro level to a micro level of study. Another critique is it has nothing to do with the legitimacy of the studies. It has to do with the expense of the studies. So longitudinal data, which is really necessary to study the influences of structural variables over time, it's expensive. And therefore, researchers doing research in this area are choosing other options. And in the end, researchers that use this perspective, at least up into the late 1970s, early 1980s, opt for cross-sectional data, which only gives you a snapshot, a one-time look at what's going on in the community, which makes it kind of hard to assess what's happening. And then, of course, there's some considerable confusion about what social disorganization actually is and how it should be measured. Some argue that it's just tautological. True by definition, it's circular, and therefore it's not scientifically testable. all of these things come